country. Our loss will have never even occurred to most people here. This guy also has a sense of humour. And again, remember, I'll ask you, when did you ever read anything like this in an American newspaper? A US Marine writes better than journalists. You know, when I was covering the 1991 Gulf War, I arrived in Saudi Arabia to find all these journalists arriving from all places like Denver. Many of them never been abroad before. All of them, though, seemed to like to wear military costume. There was actually a journalist turned up from a local TV station in the States, and he had camouflaged shoes. He had leaves painted on them. And those of you who've seen photographs of deserts or even been there will notice there aren't an awful lot of trees. The funny thing was that many of the soldiers I met, US and British, wanted to write. All the journalists wanted to be soldiers, all the soldiers wanted to be journalists. It might have been a good switch. But here is the same soldier, and here I dare you not to laugh, writing about the local government in Ramadi and how they try to set up the government. Remember, he's writing to his dad here in the States. So what news about the new government, you may ask? Well, the provisional military governor was replaced by the transitional governor, who resigned under threat and was replaced with another transitional governor. He was then replaced by the emergency appointed governor, who has just been replaced by the selected governor chosen by the elected provincial council. He never made a speech or publicised his views, never debated the other candidates, and was not present during the selection, never making an acceptance speech. He was promptly kidnapped by a rival tribe, while his tribe fought another tribe on the Syrian border. The recently displaced emergency appointed governor returned in hopes of regaining a position. However, the deputy governor is now serving as the acting governor, while the actual selected governor is in captivity. But there was an election, so democracy is in full bloom, I am to understand. This guy can write. We are now trying to force the power of decision onto the elected provincial council and the city officials. It is a difficult thing to keep myself inactive in matters of governance here. The instinct to impose order and command the requisite discipline in the Iraqi leadership must be quelled in order to allow sovereign stewardship to develop at its native pace and in a native form. I fight myself to remain insignificant in the process. I haven't the nature for passive observation. I share the American fascination with action, and it has consistently betrayed us in our foreign policy. Our continued involvement will continue the state of dependency, and our eventual departure will leave nothing but cosmetic structure here. Iraq will return to what it is. Our common sense is not common to this people, and that understanding must be given proper respect. I do my best, but I twitch with an urge for the folly of intrusion. Isn't that brilliant? Yeah, he deserves your applause. But we journalists don't write like that. When have you ever read anything like this in the LA Times, or the San Francisco Chronicle, or the Orange County Register? This is the problem. This is the problem. But there are many others. Look, here is one of the many clippings I've been getting ready for the companion volume to my last book. Here's a report. The date of this would be March 22nd, 2006. It's a report from the New York Times on how the Israeli police stopped a vehicle carrying a bomb with 10 Palestinians inside. And apparently they had intelligence that this vehicle was being driven to Jerusalem. After highway chase, Israeli police seize 10 Palestinians and a bomb, is the headline. But when you come to paragraph 16, you find this. No suspects were seized, but a 10-year-old Palestinian girl in a taxi was killed when Israeli soldiers fired on the vehicle. Now, journalism school teaches you that the biggest part of the story should be in paragraph 1. The big story here is that a 13-year-old girl was killed, but it's in paragraph 16. Why? Because the journalist didn't spot the significance, or because it was the Israelis, not the Palestinians, who shot the little girl? Why do our politicians not plan for the future? Why don't journalists look ahead? Why don't we look a year in front, 2 years in front? One of the reasons I fear is that we reporters go with our notebooks and we have lots of clippings and we Google. This is my hatred of the internet coming through again. But we don't take history books with us to Bosnia or to Northern Ireland or or to the Gulf or to Iraq. We don't remember that the British invaded Iraq in 1917, part of the First World War, in which my father, my dad, who was much older than my mother, who was a soldier, Third Battle of the Somme, part of the reason for the First World War was to destroy the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. And we occupied Baghdad in 1917, and General Angus Maud, British commander, made an announcement, which I've got a copy of at home, cost me $2,000 in an auction, but it's the original. We come here, he said of the British Army, 1917, we come here not as conquerors, but as liberators to free you from generations of tyranny. We're always going to free these people. And we always come, of course, with our Humvees and our swords and our horses and our helmets and our Apache helicopters and our M1A1 Abrams tanks. In 1920, an insurgency against the British occupation. What happened? We besieged Fallujah, we besieged Najaf. British intelligence told the War Department in London. When did the War Department become the Ministry of Defence all around the world? We told them that terrorists were crossing the border from Syria. This is 1920. Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, stood up in the House of Commons, 1920, and said, if British troops leave Iraq now, there will be chaos and civil war. Winston Churchill even organised a surge. And then we went over to using the British Air Force to bomb recalcitrant Iraqis, just like the Americans do the same now. I don't think we bombed quite as many wedding parties in Afghanistan, but nonetheless, we did the same pattern, and we don't read history. Why didn't we plan for post-war Iraq? I know there were plans in the State Department, Rumsfeld basically tore them up, but why weren't there real plans? I think one of the reasons, well, there are two reasons. Firstly, because our politicians and statesmen today have no experience of war. Not one of them. Well, McCain does if he becomes the president, but that's the only one. When I grew up, you know, Prime Ministers of Britain, Attlee, who was in the First World War, Eden, who was in the First World War, as well as Foreign Secretary in the Second, Churchill had been in the Battle of Omdurman and the trenches of the First World War. Even when I was correspondent in Northern Ireland for the Times, before Rupert Murdoch, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland was William Whitelaw, who was in the crossing of the Rhine in 1945. These people knew what it was like to see people who had been blown apart, including their friends. But today, do you think Tony Blair knows anything about war except what he sees on TV? Do you think Gordon Brown does? Well, we know that Mr. Bush felt it necessary to defend the skies of Texas from the Viet Cong. But the point is that there isn't any leader in the world today, in the West, plenty in the other part of the world, who have any experience of war. But there's another problem. And that is that television, 24-hour TV, constant press conferences impose new priorities on our leaderships. It's not, what are we going to do with Iraq after we capture it? It's, can we get Saddam's capture on prime time tonight at 6 p.m. or shall we announce it by 10 p.m. Mr. Prime Minister, is the press conference at 4 o'clock now? How are we going to present what happened in Baghdad this morning? Everything is pinned to the next hour, the next 24 hours, how we'll present something. It's presentation. Hence we have a State Department official touring the Middle East, apparently under the illusion that there's nothing wrong with US policies, it's the presentation of them that just didn't get it right. I couldn't resist going to one of these meetings in Beirut with the Lebanese press, which eventually, after we'd listened to two former US diplomats, one of them speaking very good Arabic, explaining American policy and saying, you haven't quite understood it. Eventually, thank God, one of the Lebanese journalists stood up and said, "Sir, it's the policies that are a problem, not the bloody presentation of them." You see, and this is a problem, the idea that we don't challenge authority, which is what our job should be as foreign correspondents. And presidents and prime ministers don't expect to be challenged. They don't have to be, if Judith Miller is writing about weapons of mass destruction in the New York Times. But the problem is this fawning on leadership by the press, which the leadership love, continues. You know, the New York Times had all these allegations, courtesy of Ahmed Shalaby, about weapons of mass destruction. After the war, we had this long, tedious, boring article full of mea culpas. We won't do it again. We should have asked more details. And what do you get in the New York Times now? Syria has weapons of mass destruction. Iran has weapons of mass destruction. And so it goes on and on and on. The narrative written by the president or the prime minister, eagerly taken up by us as journalists. It wasn't always like this.